Two people can earn the exact same salary for 10 straight years. Same job title, same paycheck, same city, same cost of living, same starting point. And yet, a decade later, one has quietly built real wealth. Investments, savings, options. The other is still living paycheck to paycheck, wondering where it all went. The difference isn't intelligence. It isn't luck. It rarely comes down to a single decision, a lucky break, or a missed opportunity. It begins somewhere much less visible, inside the brain, in patterns most people never examine. This isn't a story about hard work versus laziness. Most people who stay financially stuck work incredibly hard. It's a story about psychology, the invisible mental architecture that quietly decides how money is earned, spent, saved, and grown, long before any spreadsheet gets involved. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why two identical incomes can produce two completely different financial futures. Here's something almost no one tells you. Your brain wasn't built to build wealth. It was built to survive the next 24 hours. For most of human history, resources were immediate. Food spoiled, danger was constant. A brain optimized for long-term financial planning would have been a disadvantage in an environment where the real threat was starving by next week. This ancient wiring didn't disappear. It just got repurposed. Neuroscientists studying decision-making have found that the brain strongly favors immediate, certain rewards over delayed, uncertain ones, a bias sometimes called present bias. This is why spending $70 tonight can feel more real, more urgent, than the idea of that same $70 becoming several times its value 20 years from now. The future gain is abstract. The present pleasure is not. Financial stagnation, in many cases, isn't a failure of willpower. It's the predictable result of a brain running ancient software in a modern financial world it was never designed for. But some people learn, consciously or not, to override this software. And that override usually starts somewhere unexpected. Psychology 1. Identity precedes income. Most people assume behavior changes first, and identity follows. Save money, and eventually you'll feel like a saver. Psychology suggests the opposite is usually true. Self-perception theory, a well-established concept in psychology, argues that people infer who they are largely by observing their own behavior, and then act in ways consistent with that self-image going forward. This means identity isn't just a result of financial habits. It's often the cause of them. Someone who unconsciously identifies as bad with money will make small, repeated decisions that confirm that identity, not out of stupidity, but because the brain works hard to stay consistent with its existing self-concept, a phenomenon researchers call cognitive consistency. Meanwhile, someone who identifies as someone who builds wealth, even before they have much of it, starts making dozens of small decisions that quietly reinforce that identity, not through motivation, through consistency. This is why financial transformation rarely starts with a budget spreadsheet. It starts with a shift in self-concept, and the numbers follow later. Someone who begins describing themselves, even quietly, as someone building financial stability, tends to make noticeably different micro-decisions than someone who still privately thinks of themselves as just trying to get by, even if their bank balances start out identical. But identity alone doesn't explain everything. There's a second mechanism working underneath it, one tied directly to how the brain handles reward. Psychology 2. Delayed gratification rewires success. In the late 1960s, a psychologist ran an experiment that would become one of the most cited studies in behavioral science. Children were offered a simple choice: eat one marshmallow now, wait several minutes alone in a room, and receive 2. Follow-up research years later found that children who managed to delay gratification tended to show better outcomes across several life measures decades afterward, though later researchers have rightly pointed out that environment and trust in the experimenter also played a significant role. The deeper insight isn't about marshmallows, it's about a trainable mental skill, tolerating short-term discomfort in exchange for long-term gain. This skill directly maps onto financial behavior. Someone able to tolerate the mild discomfort of not spending today tends to accumulate resources that compound significantly over time. Neuroscience offers a clue why this is so difficult. Immediate rewards activate the brain's reward circuitry, involving dopamine release, more intensely than distant, abstract ones. This means resisting an impulsive purchase isn't simply a matter of discipline, it's actively working against a real neurological pull. However, this pull can be weakened through repeated practice, which is exactly why small, consistent financial habits often outperform occasional bursts of willpower. But delayed gratification alone isn't enough, because willpower, as psychology has repeatedly shown, is far less reliable than most people assume. Psychology number 3, emotional control beats motivation. Motivation is often treated like the secret ingredient to financial success. Psychology tells a more complicated story. Motivation is inherently unstable. It fluctuates with mood, sleep, stress, and circumstance, which makes it a fragile foundation for something that requires years, sometimes decades, of consistent behavior. Consider a common scenario. A stressful day ends with an impulsive online purchase, not because the item is needed, but because spending temporarily soothes an uncomfortable emotional state. Psychologists call this emotional spending, using money as a short-term regulation tool for feelings rather than a rational resource decision. People with stronger emotional regulation skills are able to notice that emotional urge without immediately acting on it, creating a small but critical gap between feeling and behavior. That gap is where most significant financial decisions are actually made or lost. This is why financially successful people aren't necessarily more motivated. They're often simply better at managing the emotional impulses that quietly sabotage financial decisions for everyone else. But even strong emotional regulation can break down under one specific, often overlooked condition. Psychology number 4, why poor decisions often come from cognitive overload. Here's a detail rarely discussed in conversations about financial behavior. Poor decision-making is often less about character and more about mental bandwidth. Cognitive load refers to the amount of mental resources being used at any given moment, and that resource is limited. Researchers studying decision-making under financial scarcity have found something striking. When people are preoccupied with pressing financial concerns, their measurable cognitive performance on unrelated tasks temporarily drops, a phenomenon researchers describe using the term scarcity mindset. This creates a difficult cycle. Financial stress consumes cognitive bandwidth. Reduced cognitive bandwidth leads to worse financial decisions. Worse financial decisions produce more financial stress. This helps explain why financial struggles often don't stem from a single bad decision, but from an ongoing mental environment where sound decision-making becomes genuinely harder to access. Picture someone juggling overdue bills, a demanding job, and a looming rent payment all in the same week. Even a straightforward decision, comparing 2 loan offers or choosing whether to repair or replace a car, becomes harder to evaluate clearly, not because the person lacks intelligence, but because their available mental bandwidth is already spent elsewhere. It also explains why financial stability, once achieved, tends to compound. Less scarcity means more available cognitive bandwidth, which leads to clearer, more strategic financial decisions going forward. The system isn't just financial, it's cognitive, and breaking the cycle usually requires reducing mental load, not simply trying harder under the exact same pressure. But there's a resource that matters even more than raw willpower or bandwidth, one most people underestimate entirely. Psychology 5. Skills compound faster than money. Most people think about wealth primarily in terms of money. Self-made wealthy individuals, according to numerous behavioral studies, tend to think primarily in terms of skill. This distinction matters enormously. Money on its own is a finite, extractable resource. Skill is a compounding one. Every new capability makes the next one easier to acquire, creating an accelerating return over time. This connects to a well-documented psychological pattern called the mastery orientation, a mindset focused on long-term skill development and continuous improvement, rather than short-term outcomes. People with a strong mastery orientation tend to view financial setbacks differently. A failed venture isn't treated purely as a loss. It's treated as a data point, feeding directly into the next attempt. This reframing has a real neurological basis. Deliberate skill practice triggers measurable neuroplastic changes in the brain, physically strengthening the neural pathways associated with that skill through repetition. In other words, every skill developed today quietly becomes a mental asset, one that, unlike money, can't be lost in a downturn, a scam, or a bad year. But developing skill alone won't build wealth without one more critical psychological ingredient. Psychology number 6. The psychology of calculated risk. There's a common myth that wealthy individuals are simply bigger risk takers. Behavioral research paints a more precise picture. Self-made wealthy individuals typically aren't reckless risk takers. They're calculated ones, a distinction rooted in a psychological concept called risk assessment accuracy. Poor financial decisions often stem not from taking risks, but from taking poorly evaluated ones, driven by emotion, urgency, or social pressure rather than clear analysis. Successful risk takers tend to separate two things most people accidentally merge: the size of a potential loss and the emotional intensity of the moment. This connects to a concept called loss aversion, a well-established finding in behavioral economics showing that people generally feel the pain of a loss roughly twice as intensely as the pleasure of an equivalent gain. This asymmetry causes many people to avoid reasonable, well-calculated opportunities out of a disproportionate fear of loss, even when the underlying math clearly favors the risk. Financially successful individuals aren't necessarily more comfortable with risk emotionally. They've simply trained themselves to evaluate it analytically rather than reactively. This distinction, analytical evaluation over emotional reaction, shows up again and again in research on high-performing financial decision makers. But underneath all of these individual psychological traits lies one final, quieter habit, the one that ties everything together. Psychology number 7, the hidden habit of self-made wealthy people. Across numerous studies and interviews with self-made wealthy people, one behavioral pattern appears more consistently than almost any other: relentless, structured reflection. Not vague optimism, not blind confidence, deliberate, repeated review of decisions. What worked, what didn't, and why. This connects to a psychological process called metacognition, essentially thinking about your own thinking. People with strong metacognitive habits are significantly better at identifying flawed reasoning in their own decisions rather than only recognizing it in others. In practice, this often looks unremarkable: a short weekly review of spending decisions, a habit of asking, after a financial choice, was that decision driven by strategy or emotion? This single habit, consistent, honest self-review, quietly compounds over years, gradually correcting small decision-making errors before they become expensive patterns. It's rarely dramatic. It's almost never visible from the outside. But across the psychological research on financial behavior, this quiet habit of reflection shows up again and again as one of the most consistent traits separating long-term financial growth from long-term financial stagnation. Wealth was never purely a financial outcome. It's the visible result of an invisible pattern: identity, emotional regulation, cognitive bandwidth, skill, calculated risk, and quiet reflection, repeated consistently over years most people never see. Two people can start in the exact same place, earn the exact same income, and end up in two entirely different futures, not because one was smarter or luckier, but because one, somewhere along the way, began working with their own psychology instead of against it. The real question was never how much you earn. It's what your mind has quietly been trained to do with it.